This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship.
About engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues.
And how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week, we're going to discuss the biology of democracy. What are the elements of human biology and human evolution that are relevant in thinking about the challenges and the future of democracy? It's a topic that many democratic theorists, myself included, are ill-prepared to talk about. We are very fortunate to have, I think, the person who's writing the most interesting work on this topic, on the biology of human societies today. This is a highly regarded scholar, researcher, explorer, who I've had the great fortune to get to know in the last few months. His name is Mark Moffett. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Jeremy, I'm delighted.
Mark is often called the Indiana Jones of entomology by the National Geographic Society, which is great. I wish someone would call me something like that. He's a modern-day explorer with more than a little luck on his side, having accidentally sat on one of the world's deadliest snakes. That's another podcast for us to talk about. Battled drug lords with dart guns and scrambled up trees to escape elephants, all part of his mission to find new species and behaviors in remote places. Currently, Mark is studying the stability of societies across animal species. That's part of our topic today, and how humans in the present day deal with these issues. He's the author of many books and articles in academic and popular magazines. Most recently, the book that I've read and enjoyed and highly recommend to everyone, The Human Swarm. It's a great title. How Our Societies Arise, Thrive, and Fall. Mark's received a lot of awards for his work. And again, they're academic awards, but they're also the kinds of cool non-academic awards that very few scholars receive. The one I wanted to just single out is the Lowell Thomas Medal from the Explorers Club for his studies climbing into forest canopies around the world. So we have a really interesting guest today. Before we get to our conversation with Mark, of course, we have Zachary's scene-setting poem. Zachary, what's the title of your poem today?
You don't really wish you were on a mountainside.
I don't, so let's hear it.
If it weren't for your rosy lips, your sparkling eyes, your shaking hips, if it weren't for the stories that you told me in the rain, if it weren't for the memory of all misfortune, all the pain, I'd probably be sitting on a rock somewhere, running my hand through my overgrown hair. I'd look down at the canyon where they used to do the rafting, and I'd watch the empty hill and such, and stare up at the clouds, and when nightfall shrouds the mist on fields no longer plowed, then I'd lay back on the rock and bring myself to sleep, laughing. But I stay here, waiting at a bus stop at the center of a wheel of human habitation, recreation, occupation. I sit here by the bus stop on a park bench made of steel. I feel dollars in my pockets where there should be wild fruits. I see the wild horsemen instead on buses wearing suits. If it weren't for the way it all seems to snap right into place when you are reading Shakespeare on my tapestry of lace. If it weren't for the way it feels to hold it all inside and only see it drip, drip, drop, whispering, hide, you don't really wish you were on a mountainside. If it weren't for the way you come into focus in my eyes, and I can see you over there, buried in their jackets and silk ties. If it weren't for the miracle that it all grows up and it all dies, I'd be on all fours right now, swatting away the flies.
I love the arc of that poem, Zachary, and I love the contradictions and the visualizations. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about sort of trying to comprehend how thin the basis of civilization is, and the ways in which so much of it depends on some strange human tendency to read Shakespeare or to fall in love. And I think that it really captures how close we are to being wild again.
Right, we're not as advanced as we think we are.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Mark, I think this is a perfect entry point. Your work emphasizes so beautifully and so vividly the challenges different species have, including human beings, living with those who are different. You look at ants, you look at all kinds of animals, you look at human beings, of course. How have humans learned to live together with those who are different from us in ways that other species have not?
Well, I'd say Zachary's poem hit me just square center there, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about things on mountainsides and in rainforests, and that was true of predecessors in biology, even Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, spending all those years in the jungle just contemplating things away from their versions of the internet and just thinking. And so what I've thought about is the fact that I've had a chance to live not only with different creatures in many parts of the world, but with tribal and hunter-gatherer groups, and to contemplate how societies function. And by society, I mean a group other than our immediate family, to which we feel a great allegiance and we're willing to fight for and even die for, these things that persist through the generations. And when you look at societies in animals, the accommodation, living with those who are different boils down to accommodating diversity, living with more than the immediate family. It's basically stripped down to that. Identification with that group trumps kinship in many cases, and even cooperation. Societies can have their enemies within them and friends outside and so forth, both in animals and certain animals and some humans. And so those are all interesting questions to consider. And I'll start off by describing what I think is the most remarkable thing in the world, which is a coffee shop like a Starbucks. I don't know if you have them in Austin. I suppose you do. But they are...
We have Starbucks and we have all kinds of local coffee shops.
Oh, probably better than Starbucks. But the most amazing thing about them, no matter what the brand is, you can walk into them and not want to kill everyone or run away in terror. See, this would be impossible for a chimpanzees. And this was something suddenly struck me at one point. A chimpanzee has to know everyone in the room to be comfortable. Humans don't. Chimpanzees don't allow us for strangers. Humans do. And that's true of many kinds of species with societies, from lions and elephants and so forth. And the allowance for strangers that human beings have come up with is determined by what I call markers. And those are different aspects of identity. We're basically walking billboards for who we are. And so we can move around people, and we're constantly sensing those around us as others we are comfortable with, based on all these signals that they're putting out. We're doing it at a very high rate. This is the center of a lot of psychology studies now. And they include all kinds of big things like culture, but all kinds of small things too, cues that are not even consciously recognized. There's a researcher, Abigail Marsh at Georgetown, who has found that, from a great distance, you can detect whether someone is an American by how they walk or wave their hand. People don't realize they can do it, but they do. They have this ability, and it's not something they even could consciously think about most of the time. So we are registering people all the time, and those registrations are what allows strangers to exist. To get to your question, allowing for those that are different is something that humans really have excelled at beyond what any other species can do. These identities, all these markers, signals of our identity, in hunter-gatherers would have been very similar. Their societies had little diversity. They had nothing equivalent to an ethnic group within them. But the incorporation of massive numbers of different peoples has been the single most radical innovation in the history of the human society. And it gave societies the option of growing by absorbing formerly separate adversarial groups to create ethnicities. Groups that once comprised their own societies came to occupy the same society. And the story of how that happened and how these identities allowed it to happen, all these markers I talked about, is really the history of humanity. Because healthy societies don't freely merge. This is something I discovered looking through the animal kingdom. Societies stay apart unless there's something severely wrong. So incorporating outsiders was a big deal. The fact that we can do this at all.
And Mark, to me, this is stunning what you've said, because the assumption among historians and political theorists, right, is that there's some state of nature human beings are in. This is obviously an artificial intellectual construct, and that they naturally gravitate towards society and democracy. This is, of course, what Aristotle writes and many philosophers after that. You're saying just the opposite. You're saying that this was actually not foreordained and that it actually took a lot of work. How did it happen then? How would you rewrite that history?
Well, we always had the capacity to allow in outsiders in our society, and that's was a necessity for animals and early humans because our societies were quite small. So you had to have, you would be inbreeding unless you could have a means of letting others in. And so that would happen one at a time, usually a mate transferring between societies. And when that person transferred, they would have to take on some of these aspects of our local identity to become acceptable to us. And this assimilation in its earliest manifestation was simply married people arriving, or maybe survivors from a war, just one or two individuals that would be allowed into a hunter-gatherer group. This accelerated greatly when our societies settled down. Hunter-gatherers that moved around had societies of 1,000 or two. Any society of more than 2,000 anywhere in history has a history of war, subjugation, and possibly slavery. And this is how it came about. Recent times, mass immigration arose, but that wasn't there in early history. We didn't have mixed societies of all kinds of ethnicities. Even in hunter-gatherer times, in their small societies, people were pretty uniform, as I said. But because immigration is based on the same psychology of the history we had with war and subjugation, these underlying power and status differences haven't changed. We are comfortable with immigrants coming into the country if they're contributing without competing for desired jobs and resources. And so this is a continued problem. Incoming people and ethnic groups, that is minor ethnic groups, small population ethnic groups, not the majority, but other ethnic groups, have to have a lower status than us, as they did in these early times of which were dominated by war, even today. And these differences in status is certainly a problem for democracies.
It's such a good point, Mark, and it really captures, I think, one of the key characteristics and challenges of our societies today is managing the different populations, especially in a world where we need talent pools that come from other places, and where people are moving more rapidly, perhaps, than ever before from place to place. What are some of the strategies, in addition to hierarchy, that you described that societies have used to survive and stay together when so much of what you're saying points to the forces that tear them apart? How have they stayed together despite these forces?
Well, there's a lot to be gained in larger societies, particularly over the long term. Incoming people have to invest part of their identity and social obligations into the greater society of which they're a part. And so, in fact, minorities, in a sense, are like societies within a society. They have their own identity, but they also have a superordinate identity, psychologists would say, society-wide commonalities that distinguish the us versus them differences. And that allows us people to live together. And people are fine with that. Part of it is called system justification. People often see their position in society as natural. So even people of lower status in the society will see that as something deserved. And of course, that is something, it would be nice to work against that, but it's just it's a strategy in a sense for survival. And people, of course, over the generations, ethnic people will hopefully move up in status. And but there's this question of who really belongs. And this is what really is at the basis of the problem that democracies place. If I tell you, you may know this question, but to think of an American. Think of an American. And virtually anyone, no matter what their ethnic group, will immediately envision a white male. And in a way, the dominant members of societies, which are the group that initially formed the society and has control over the resources and symbols of that nation, remain the pure representatives of that society. So, there are studies showing that people of Asian descent who are born in the U.S., they could celebrate our American flag, and yet studies show that they more readily associate that flag with white Americans than with fellow Asian Americans. And so these distinctions are there and really hard to work against if you want to believe that everyone is equal in a democracy.
And what happens when this whole system goes south? Why is it if we gain so much from cooperating within these hierarchies that we see wars and things like that? Is that a natural product of the system, or is it the system collapsing?
Well, I argue in the book, Jared Diamond has books out, Collapse and so forth, where he talks about societies falling apart, and he basically points to a certain number of extreme examples of that, where wars or famine come along. And I would argue that he's only getting a very tiny portion of the picture, because all societies go through a cycle. And part of that cycle is that identities change and societies shatter. Over time, even if we were a racially pure society, the way we think about each other would deviate here and there until people wouldn't get along. That's what happened with hunter-gatherers with their more uniform societies. Languages would change in different parts of their territory and so forth, and eventually their societies would break. And even in, among the societies of recent times, the archaeologist Joyce Marcus has found that state societies across antiquity right up to today have a finite lifespan, normally ranging from 2 to 5 centuries. And hunter-gatherers probably had societies that lasted about that long too. So we think of America as a young society, but it's actually rather middle-aged, and it's showing its creakiness and these divergences in the way people are identifying with that society now.
And Mark, would you say that democracy is an advantage from American society, or has it become a disadvantage from a biological point of view?
Well, the main problem is, again, how we treat each other in terms of defining what democracy is and who it applies to. Because possessing a passport is something worked out by governments, and that's been largely uncoupled from how our brains register who belongs. So the formal requirements of citizenship and the psychological assessments of membership don't mesh. So an immigrant arrives and goes through all these tests and learns things that most citizens don't even know, and yet that doesn't really matter. Membership at the most intimate level isn't a matter of knowing facts, but it's a way of being. It's a way of walking, talking. It's all these subtle clues we sense in each other. And it's impossible to put into immigration laws this kind of deep tissue of national identity. And so when sociologist T.H. Marshall talked about citizenship, he talked about it being accepted as a full member of the society. But what is meant by full? People have different statuses as members of societies, and that's expressed in sort of the strategies, the expressions of how people identify with the society, the nationalists and patriots of societies, which as psychologists look at, I strip it down to the idea that nationalists are focused on protection and patriots are focused on providing for their people. So nationalists are very defense-oriented. Patriots, make sure everybody has what they need. But who is their people? Nationalists tend to prize those aspects of identity that are set apart by the trusted majority, whereas patriots are more inclusive of minorities, and yet they still show biases if you look at them closely. So nationalists, because they're focused on other people of other nationalities and minority members as being more of an outsider group, take a narrow view of who truly is part of a society. And they're more comfortable with this majoritarian idea of democracy in which the dominant people, the people in control, have the primary say in governance. So hence, which votes counts depends on your point of view, these expressions of how you identify with the society. And those alternative views, both are expressions of democracies. And, I have my own opinion about which one is right, but they're both logically consistent views on, which votes count.
It's so interesting. It maps on to what many of us write about in terms of the history of the Republican and the Democratic parties, and the ways in which they define who's included and who isn't, and how it changes over time. So it's really interesting to me, Mark, how the biological logic and evidence that you've analyzed so deeply overlaps. It, I think, reinforces and runs parallel to the historical evidence that we see. Do you believe that many of the issues we're having in American society today have this biological root? Is that how you would look at our divisions today?
Well, you can, whether you think of them as genetically rooted or just universally learned, they are deeply rooted things, and they're not easily changeable. Once these biases, psychologists show, are true even for liberal-minded people. Liberal-minded people still have a greater pride in their own group, and because of that pride, they can, without recognizing it, be biased against other groups. So, how you have situations like where doctors give better treatment to people of their own ethnic group or the majority ethnic group than others without even recognizing it. And they would probably be totally surprised that they're doing this. So the fact that societies and these ethnicities and races manage to stick together despite these prejudices is amazing to me, though, because other species can't do it. So this is the really good news. We're at least able to do that. And we don't need to be negative about ethnicities and races or other societies. We can gain from them, and we can get a positive view on them. The trouble is that once we start building in negative biases, they're very hard to erase, and particularly at times of social stress. This is when these points of view, really arise. And Sumner is talked about the fact that it takes war for a society to draw a society together. That was more than a century ago. But looking at it closely, the problem there is that it doesn't necessarily draw the society together. It draws the majority people together much more than the ethnic groups, because the majority people, Caucasians in the case of the United States, control most of the resources and symbols of the nation. And that means that ethnic groups always feel a bit as outsiders, and they're being treated as outsiders. And, right as we said today, in terms of who gets to vote and why.
It's such an important point, and I think it really helps us understand our moment, particularly your observation that stresses, and these stresses can be economic, they can be health, like something like COVID. They can also be stresses that are caused by social media and the circulation of particularly incendiary words. But those stresses exacerbate these deep divisions that you've rooted in our biological experiences, which leads me to ask the most important question, I think, Mark, the question we always like to ask on this podcast. How can we use this knowledge to improve our democracy? What should we do? It's clear that this is a big task, and in some ways biology runs against our political aims in reinforcing and growing and creating a more diverse democracy. Nonetheless, with that challenge, how can we use your deep knowledge and experience and research to improve our democracy? What are the things we can do coming out of your research?
Well, we're always going to have these social stresses, and our perception of the existence of different races and ethnic groups are not going to go away. No matter how much crossbreeding comes about, people divide the world into categories, including each other. And they automatically do this, and they build all kinds of expectations around them. But in terms of the what to do to strengthen democracy, at least, the dictum "all men are created equal" applies best to hunter-gatherers. They were egalitarian, ethnically uniform people. Right now, as I said, we don't have that. But what we do have is something that Jefferson first pointed out, that you need to have some sort of core identity in mind, and when formulating, ideals about rights, religious commitment, and work ethic. That's what he was talking about. You needed some commonality there among all these different people. You needed to have a strong thread of common culture and collective belonging, and that's what America's tried to do. We had to cobble it together from nothing. Most societies have an ancient history of these things. So we came out with flags and other things de novo, and our symbols have therefore become exceptionally important to us because we don't have a really, really deep history like China does. But even Jefferson fretted that the flood of immigrants would warp the direction and create of the U.S. and create a incoherent mass. I think he said. So we have to create in the people who come in, immigrants, and among the community here, a sense of this common culture, and that has to be strong. And the trick about that is that the dominant people controls that core. They really decide more than anyone else what makes us American, how you should behave, and so forth. It isn't a perceived unity. It isn't a unity across all people who does do that.
And so, just sort of building on that, what would you advise our listeners who care about the future of democracy, who are concerned that these biological pressures towards violence, separation, hatred, that these pressures are winning out today? What would you encourage them to do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, keeping this expectation of a common culture and a core that really matters to everyone as much as possible. And of course, even that's being torn at from left and right around what's most important there. But, that thread is what holds societies together. The other rather oddly fortunate thread for us is that most societies nowadays, looking through the archaeological history, fall apart along boundary lines that were once different societies within them. Ethnic groups that occupied this area versus that area, for example. The different parts of was once the Soviet Union, for example, broke off in logical places. We don't have any logical places to break. There are no, Indian tribes are too small in population to carve out a big part of the U.S. for themselves, a single Indian tribe. We are mixed around everywhere. So we're kind of stuck with each other. The Civil War failed because there were actually attempts to get some kind of common identity thrust at the people down there, the sense that they belong together. But really, most of them down there thought of themselves as Americans, even during the war. And there was no sense of, the war broke down at the end, I think in part because there was no sense of urgency around a common identity of being Southern. So even though there are regional differences today, there's no distinct boundary lines to them. And this sense of being stuck with each other, I think, is a good thing because we learn from each other and we gain from each other. The patterns of stress around periods of trouble that we're going through now come and go through history. There's been a cycle. There's a fellow named Peter Turkin who looks at the cycles of history and finds that there's a 50-year cycle of this kind of stress, the 1960s, 1910s, 1860s, and so forth. And we're now in the worst of it, unfortunately. I wish I had been born a little later so I could experience what will probably be a great time in 2040. But, I think we are just dealing with behaviors that are intrinsic to humans that are hard to get around, but actually lead to our success. There's a question of why we have so many kinds of personalities in our societies. Why all these personality differences? Why are there nationalists and patriots? Why are there all these, people that are open to experience? The 5 big personality traits that psychologists talk about. And I think this is part of the reason for our success. It isn't that we get along with each other. In fact, since the beginning, there have been people with nationalist and patriotic points of view. Hunter-gatherers had them. Societies all around the world have them. And the dialogue between them, the arguments, the exasperation may be part of how we work out things to decide how much to invest in defense versus nurturing our people. It just may be an arduous way that the human species works.
It's such an important point, and the great historian of a prior generation, William McNeill, had written about this. He was actually in dialogue and often critical of Jared Diamond, who you commented on before. McNeill's argument was precisely yours, that if you look at the historical record, the societies that have more diversity have periods of disorder, but that actually produces innovation. And that innovation is often what takes them out of their disorder and allows them to thrive, as you were positing that we will in 2040, hopefully so. Across American history, that's certainly been the case. It is our divisions that have also led to some of our greatest breakthroughs. If you think about progressive policy reform, if you think about the New Deal, if you think about the ways in which many of our technological centers and our universities and others have grown. So there does seem to be a comparative advantage to diversity if you can get through those cycles of division and make it to the moments of innovation, which is what you're positing. Zachary, does this resonate with you? I know your generation worries quite a lot about the future of our society, more than Mark and I did when we were your age, I think. And does this biological perspective help you to understand where we've come from? And does it offer you similar optimism to the optimism that I think Mark and I share about this?
I think it does. I think that this sort of broader view of human history allows us to see the ways in which our period isn't a novelty, that our division isn't new, and that these moments of stress and social strain can in the end produce better societies. And I think this argument about the sort of a common culture is important, but I think also that common culture has to come from everyone. And part of what makes human groups so powerful is that we're able to draw from so many different influences, and even from the natural world. In many cases as well.
Right, and create a more vibrant common culture, which
Exactly.
comes from that diversity. Mark, I want to give you the last word. One of the really interesting points I took away from your book, The Human Swarm, that again I hope everyone reads, is that we continue to have a lot to learn about democracy from studying non-humans, from studying other animals. I would just like to hear you reflect on that a little more, because so many of the people we talk to on this podcast, so many of the people, quite frankly, I interact with, are the people like myself who study human beings. Of course, you're doing that too. But what's so unique about your work and the work of the great Edmund Wilson, who you worked with, is that you go well beyond humans to teach us in a way. I guess Jane Goodall does also, that by studying non-humans, we learn a lot. I would just like to close on that, how we can learn about democracy from the non-human species.
Well, yeah, it's, what's fun now in science is the possibility of free ranging across disciplines. And that's been what I've tried to do. And that was what my mentor, E.O. Wilson, is known for too, because there's a lot of narrowness now. And, people in political science aren't necessarily finding out what anthropologists are learning or psychologists. And the psychology of how these things done is how these things transpire in societies is fascinating. It can be applied through all kinds of things in history, including to how animals respond to each other. The question of it being appropriate to compare to animals is one I'm faced with all the time when I talk to people. I study ants, and people found that very inappropriate at times. They think, "Wow, what are you talking about ants and humans?" And I go like, comparing two things that are identical is extremely boring. Real insights in science come about by finding points of comparison between things that are ordinarily thought of as really different. And that's what ants and humans allow us to look at, because ants, despite the fact having no brains, practically, very tiny brains, and not looking at all like us, looking like aliens, end up actually being much more like modern humans than chimpanzees. No chimpanzees has assembly lines and teamwork and roadways and infrastructure and highway rules and all the kinds of things ants do. And why is that? Because ants and humans have these societies where they can be around strangers. Chimpanzees can't do that. Once you have that capacity, you can have societies of millions, and some ants create these huge societies. And once you have a society of millions, you have to deal with public waste issues, and ants do that and humans do that. Chimpanzees don't worry about public waste, I can tell you. Their feces are getting thrown about. So the ants and human comparisons actually yield a lot of stuff, and there's actually points in which ants actually have something comparable to a democracy, and so do honeybees. They have a kind of choice by voter turnout. If there's a problem with the nest and they have to move, what they do is they fan out and everybody looks for a new place to move, to a new home. And they come back and they inform others about it. And once enough individuals arrive at the same choice, it's as if they voted for that choice. And it's called achieving a quorum, and everybody just decides to go there. So they do choose things in a way that's a kind of primitive version of a democracy, at least. When then in an emergency, it has to be dealt with fast. The whole colony can die unless they find a good nest. And so that's how they do it.
Mark, that is inspiring, truly inspiring what you just shared with us. And it captures one of the core themes of our podcast, which is that we can learn so much about how to improve our society by moving beyond the headlines and the daily partisan babble and actually looking deeply at our world and other worlds and taking lessons, ideas, and inspiration from them. You've modeled that so perfectly. Again, I want to encourage our listeners, if they want more, with the same enthusiasm, to read The Human Swarm, your book. And Mark, I just want to thank you for joining us and sharing so many of your insights with us. Thank you, Mark.
Jeremy, it's been a delight, and Zachary too. Anyway, I hope I can get down sometime to your neck of the woods and maybe teach a class or something. Anyway, it'd be fun to see you again.
You have an open door invitation to come to class anytime. I know my students would love to hear you and enjoy time with you. Zachary, I want to thank you for your wonderful, thoughtful poem as always, and most of all, we want to thank our listeners for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.